A very warm welcome to today's webinar, where we will be exploring the intricate relationship between national goals of the green transition and rural communities throughout the Nordic region. It's a pleasure to have each of you here today, as we will delve into the challenges and opportunities on how we can empower and engage communities affected by green transition objectives. As we witness the surge in renewable energy initiatives, we find ourselves at the intersection between progress and community well-being. And today we aim to address the concerns echoing throughout Nordic rural landscapes, where residents living in the vicinity of these projects often feel the weight of national green transition policies, sparking a palpable sense of powerlessness and resistance. My name is Mari Weienmeier. I'm a research fellow here at Nordregio, which is a Nordic research centre for regional and development and spatial planning under the Nordic Council of Ministers. And this webinar today is facilitated by the Thematic Group for Green and Inclusive Rural Development in the Nordics for 2021-2024. And this webinar is structured in two parts. First, we will hear from the policy brief connected to the report Can Local Value Creation Induce a Sense of Justice During the Green Transition, which has been written by our colleague research fellow Hilma Salonen at Nordregio. This will be followed by a presentation based on another Nordregio colleague and project entitled Not Just Green Transitions, and the report In All Fairness, Perceptions of Climate Change Policies and the Green Transition in the Nordic Region. And we'll be hearing from our colleague Nora Sanchez-Garson, who's a research fellow at Nordregio. And we will also hear from two invited guests. Kajsa Stina Benedict, who is an assistant professor at Tema Environmental Change and the Center for Climate Science and Policy Research at Linköping University here in Sweden, and Stine Bardeleben-Helles, the manager of a local action group for sustainable local development in rural areas, but also the political chair of the Danish climate movement. And we are super happy to have you all on board. Second, and finally, we will explore this topic further in a panel discussion, where we also want you in the audience to participate. So please use that chat function today, and don't be shy. We would also like to know that we are actually recording this session, and we will share both the recording and the PowerPoints after today's webinar. And we will also be sharing the policy brief that Hilma has written when that's published in January. Anyway, without much further ado, I'd like to invite Hilma to come onto the floor and give us our presentation for today.
Great. Thank you, Mari. Just share the presentation. So, welcome from my part as well. And I will first present the policy recommendations around which we kind of built this whole webinar to discuss the dynamics between rural actors and national goals in Nordic green transitions. And these policy recommendations are based on a case study report that was published earlier this year. And we will share a link to that in the chat as well, so you can take a closer look. So to just say a few words where this whole project started. It started from the knowledge from the literature that Nordic rural regions are kind of left in the margins, both in research and also in practical policy-making decisions. And this leads to a situation where the national climate goals are really at the risk of not realizing, because simply green transitions, they do not feel just if local people feel that they don't have the chance to participate, and they don't have a chance to participate in a way that makes sense to them, which then leads into this circle of heavy resistance. So what we wanted really to know is then what kind of benefits would create value to local communities, create this kind of ownership towards these new energy projects, and then how do different kind of benefits impact on the social acceptance of the green transition. And then to explore this question, we did 6 case studies in 6 areas in 3 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, and Norway. And it was a mix of different types of green transition projects. A lot of them had to do with wind power, which is kind of a hot potato in many countries at the moment, both kind of greenfield new wind power projects and then more established ones where there are simply more wind power being built. But then there was also some projects were kind of a more hybrid mix. For example, they involved more strategic work in sustainability transitions in firms and municipalities, or then a more hybrid mix of different kind of renewable energy sources in industrial park development. And what I really came interested in when I was working with these cases, what's between these two extremities, the standouts and then the handouts. The standouts here are represented by the Green Lab project of Skive in Denmark, which is there in the photo. And this has really become like this internationally known example of a really good case that has really transformed the whole region, has really led to a lot of new jobs in the area, a lot of new education possibilities, kind of a new type of attractiveness for the whole municipality. But it also featured a very strong involvement of the municipality from the get-go, and then also attracting a lot of public money, even private money. And of course, this type of resources, a lot of municipalities simply don't have, or it's too big of a risk to make such an investment. And then at the other extreme, it's this kind of handouts, by which I mean that a lot of people have this idea that the benefit that they can get from a wind park is this kind of a direct monetary compensation that is a one-off thing. Maybe it's something just money paid for part of the landowners who live in the direct impact zone of a new wind energy park, or maybe it can be something like building a new sports center to the village, but still something that happens once and can easily seem kind of like, you would say that it's kind of insufficient at best and then divisive at worst. So you kind of try to put the band-aids there, but then the resentment still flows through as people feel that their good opinion is trying to be bought with this thing. So then what I was really interested is kind of like how the cases usually are. So something is kind of not this very shiny example, but there's still something interesting happening in a lot of small municipalities that are trying to balance really several transitions that are happening at once: the green transition, the digital transition, and then adapting to the population decline, for example, smart adaptation, smart specialization. They often work with small resources. Maybe there's only something like one municipal worker who has to kind of deal with a lot of this strategic work. But then you still see that they may come up with new solutions that are kind of more direct, more flexible, maybe more directly rooted into the actual local needs. So then actually creating or helping with this new community building thing. So I really wanted to try and figure out how then could national policies better support this, maybe this exhausted municipal worker that we had in the photo. And I came up with some recommendations, kind of from the planning stage to when something is already happening. So in the beginning, it's very important that when these things are being envisioned, that we would promote realistic visions. There's often a problem that there's kind of like a lot of benefits being promoted, that there's going to be a huge amount of new jobs, or the local economy is going to have this big increase in revenues and so on. And if these are not realistic, they will feed into a sense of disappointment, resentment. People may feel a bit cheated on. And then also it's important to assess also the impacts realistically. For example, the noise, that it really matches the actual noise that people then encounter, so that they see that there has been transparent communication. If there is transparent communication and early engagement, then even people who still remain as opponents to wind energy, for example, they may still sense that the process was, in a sense, just, or at least they had an idea what's going on, even if they don't agree with it, and this still makes a difference. So here, how to have the early engagement and transparent communication is also kind of difficult, since often it's something that from the beginning, it's maybe something a bit abstract, something is going to happen. It's kind of something that is hard to get people interested in before it actually starts happening. So then it's still kind of like reinforces this idea that it's important to start early and utilize various platforms to foster this kind of continuous contact. Citizen panels, online platforms, also these more traditional ones where you have a broad invitation to everyone on the village, and so on. Then when, for example, the energy companies are already approaching a municipality, for example, there's the negotiation stage happening. There are some things that can help with creating more sense of fairness, with creating a better, for example, when it comes to this monetary compensation, a better distribution of compensation. And some municipalities have used, for example, joint negotiation tables. They have brought landowners together to review the agreements, to think what kind of compensation scheme would be most fair before they know where the wind park is located. So before anyone can say, I see that I could here benefit more, so I should vote in this way. And also municipalities can share information among themselves as a way to create a bit more pressure towards these energy companies, for example, to have them diversify their compensation schemes so that everyone, not only people who live in the direct impact zone, would get something. Then also when it comes to something that is not the non-monetary benefits, it's important to kind of note that often the discussion it's centered on, for example, the municipal property tax or the amount of new jobs or the revenues for the local entrepreneurs. And it's, of course, something that only some of the citizens really link to. Some people don't really care about the municipal property tax. It doesn't seem like relevant for them. But then there's a lot of other benefits as well that are indirect, but then can be much more long-term. So if there's more creative ways to visualize them, then again, people can feel more ownership towards green transition. For example, an increase in social well-being, more diverse possibilities in education, maybe creating new kind of recreational fields, creating more biodiversity, a lot of, or just the sense that the municipality is being active in a green transition is something that can be an important value for a lot of people. So, yeah, and also a lot of times these environmental goals, they tend to be a little bit abstract in people's minds. Something like trying to match the climate goals can be something that is not really relevant to one's life. But then if the environmental benefits are linked to the broader development goals of the municipality, then they can come one by one a little bit more concrete. So it's important to not work in silos when it comes to these big goals of digital transition, green transition, municipal attractiveness, but try to somehow find a common ground which links them all. And that's the end of a very quick overview of this work. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was super interesting. But I would really like to ask you a bit more about these between cases that you brought up. Could you elaborate a bit more about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I could have mentioned if I would have had more time. And I was really interested in seeing, for example, that these small municipalities, even though they are small, but in a way they can have a lot more agency because they are in a way more flexible and they can have more direct contact, for example, between different public authorities, or maybe the negotiation processes, they are a bit quicker. So then it's possible to put more resources into the negotiation process for the time being that it's there. And then it's possible to kind of, in a situation where the regulations are not like totally up to date, it's possible to kind of see that here there would be, for example, a new way to put some pressure on these energy companies, have them act where the regulations are not up to date yet. So kind of utilize the smallness to benefit. Yeah.
So this is one way that local actors in general could work then, would you say?
Yeah.
Yeah. What else could they do? What sort of other solutions are there beyond the policy parts?
Yeah, I think it's also very important to really remain active, because if the municipalities aren't active, then their role is just to like kind of give out their land, and then it's a very passive role. But then, for example, some of these industrial parks that some of the municipalities are now putting up so that they can use part of the energy that they are producing, and then maybe attract some new industries there, or then just help the industries that are already there to grow, or then diversify the education, create new regional educational models. So kind of be active from the start and think how this could relate to kind of like the overall development of the region.
So this also kind of links up then to this, labor shortage that we have in the Nordic region and the green transition, as you were talking about earlier as well. Like, there are so many things that this could actually, if we start early, maybe we'll be able to overcome some of these challenges.
Exactly.
As well.
Yeah.
Great. Do we have any questions from the chat at all?
No questions from the chat yet, but I would encourage you all to share your questions, share your comments as well.
Perfect. Well, we could just say thank you then and move over to Nora, who will also be giving us a presentation about your recent project and report.
Thank you, Mari. Yes, hello everyone. My name is Nora Sanchez-Gassen. I work as a senior research fellow here at Nordregio, and Hilma and Mari have invited me here to join the webinar today and tell you a little bit about a survey that we have done in another Nordregio project, the NJust project. So in the NJust project, we conducted a survey in all Nordic countries and the 3 autonomous regions to find out more about how people actually think about the green transition, which attitudes they have, and how they also feel the green transition in their own lives. And the interesting thing is that we can actually look specifically at where people live, so we can find out a bit more about how people in rural areas, for example, think about the green transition. So we thought this perspective would be relevant for this webinar and to bring into the discussion. So I've picked a couple of results from the survey to share with you that can tell us a little bit more how people in rural areas think, and also how that compares to attitudes of people in cities, for example. But before we go into the survey results, just a few words on the survey itself. We interviewed almost 5,200 people in the Nordic region. In the table on the right there, you can see how many people we interviewed in each country and in each of the autonomous regions. We interviewed via telephone and interviewed a representative sample of the adult population in each country or region, representative in terms of gender and in terms of the age structure. And important to know is also that the interviews were done more or less a year ago, October and November last year. That's important because, as you may remember, we were already moving into a period with high energy prices and inflation back then. So that may have affected how people answer and how they feel about certain policies. So that's important to keep in mind. But some results I wanted to share with you. I picked three results, 3 key messages. In the survey, we presented statements to the respondents and asked them to react to the statements we gave them. And one of the statements you can see here on top of the slide, the statement was, taking action on climate change would be beneficial for the economy in my country or region. So we asked about economic impacts and if people thought these would be beneficial. And people could answer to these questions or react to this statement on a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 would mean that they fully disagree. No, we don't expect any benefits to come from the green transition policies. It will not be good for the economy. And 5, they could say if they fully agree to this statement. So if they do expect economic benefits to come from climate policies and the green transition. Here on the figure, we have plotted how people have answered, and you can see that we have 4 bars here. On the very left, that bar simply represents all respondents together. So all these almost 5,200 respondents, you can see the answers of them put together there in the left column. But then we also looked specifically how people answered in different areas of residence, and all the way to the right, you can see how people in rural areas answered. And in the middle, for comparison, we also plotted for you the answers of people in cities and then in towns and suburbs. But if we start looking there at the right, the column where we can see the answers of people in rural areas, please have a look there at the top. These parts in blue, these are people who fully agree to our statements, or not perhaps fully agree, but still agree to the statement that climate policies would be beneficial for the economy in their country or region. The dark blue, 22% of the respondents in rural areas fully agree to this statement. So they're very optimistic. They do expect economic benefits. And just below in this lighter blue color, 23%, maybe don't fully agree to this statement, but to a large extent at least agree. So also people who anyway feel a degree of optimism here. If you put that together, that's 45%, not a majority, but still a sizable group of people in rural areas who do feel optimistic about the economic impacts of the green transition. Now, but if you compare that to the columns in the middle, you can see that people in cities and towns and suburbs, there were even more people who answered that they agree here. So if we put that together, we can say that there is some optimism in rural areas, but it's a bit less pronounced than in cities and towns and suburbs. So people in rural areas are a bit less optimistic, perhaps, about the economic impacts of the green transition. A second statement that we gave people and asked them to react to is the following: I am worried that some jobs in my country or region may be at risk due to the transition to a low carbon economy. So here we asked about job loss, if people were worried about that. And again, people could answer on a scale from 1 to 5. 1 if they fully disagree, so if they do not expect any job loss. 5, they could answer if they fully agree, so if they, yes, indeed are worried about job loss in their country or region. And again, if we look there at the right-hand side, the column on the right-hand side, we can see in dark blue that 17% of rural inhabitants fully agree with this statement. Another 16% agree, maybe not fully agree, but still to a large extent agree. So these are people who are indeed worried about job loss. Putting that together, that's 33%, 1 in 3 respondents in rural areas. So quite a sizable group. And again, if you compare that to the answer patterns of people in cities and towns and suburbs, you see that people in rural areas are more worried. The difference to people in towns and suburbs is not very big, but still, even there, a bit more pronounced. So people in rural areas are a bit more worried in this area, even if it's not a majority of people. And the last result that I wanted to share with you today is the following. We asked a question to people: how do you think that climate policies affect your household today in economic terms? Again, we had an answer scale from 1 to 5. People could answer 1 if they think that climate policies affect them in a very negative way. People could answer 5 if they feel that climate policies affect their household in a very positive way. And then 3 in the middle means that maybe there is no real impact, or people weren't sure about the impact. So if we look at the answer options here, then I'd like you to look first in the middle of the figures, these large yellow parts in the bars. These are people who report that they don't really feel an impact, perhaps. It's, as you can see, a majority in all the regions, in all the areas, more than 50% everywhere. So this is perhaps also striking that at the moment, perhaps a majority, at least half of the people, don't really know how they are affected. Apologies, now I switched. But then if we look at the bottom of the figure, these are the people in red who actually report negative impacts. They feel that they and their household are negatively impacted by climate policies. And you see in rural areas, they're all the way to the right, it's 14% who feel very negatively affected, and another 21% who feel negatively affected, 35%. So 1 in 3 roughly who thinks they're negatively affected. And again, you see the same pattern. People in rural areas are more likely to report negative consequences, negative impacts on their households than people in cities and towns and suburbs. So if you put all of this together, there's a certain picture emerging here, a certain pattern is emerging. We can see that people living in rural areas tend to be a bit less optimistic than people in cities regarding the economic benefits of climate action. They are a bit more concerned about the job loss, and they also are a bit more likely to report that their household is negatively affected at the moment by climate policies. One thing I didn't explicitly put here on a slide, but another thing we can see from the survey is that people in rural areas are also slightly more worried about future cost of living increases because of the green transition. So overall, the message is that people in rural areas are perhaps slightly more skeptical towards the green transition than we see in other parts of our countries. And in that sense, I think it's very good that we have projects like Hilmas that looks into how we can be better, how we can involve people in rural areas more, and also make sure that benefits stay actually in those areas and are visible also to the communities. If you would like to know more about the report and the results, you can have a look at the report that we published. It looks like the picture you can see there on the left, and you can find it on Nordregio's homepage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Super interesting. I love a good survey and all the details that comes with it. And obviously this one was on a Nordic level. So I was wondering, could you say something about like what it's like between the Nordic countries or even within them?
Exactly. Since this was a short presentation, I couldn't go very much into detail about what we find for the individual Nordic countries. But we have these results as well. You can look them up in the report. We can say that the patterns that are described here for the questions are the same everywhere. We can see similar patterns everywhere. But if we compare the countries with each other, we can see that in some Nordic countries, people are a bit more worried about climate change and a bit more keen to take action than in others. For example, in Denmark and Sweden, we see that people are very supportive of the green transition. In Finland and Norway, for example, a bit less. So these are some of the patterns we see between the countries. And that, of course, is also reflected then if you look more deeply into differences between rural and urban areas.
How interesting. And is there anything on like, like within the countries? Can you say anything about that at all?
Yeah, we also analyzed a little bit how people answered, and we do see, of course, some differences. We know already also from other surveys, and we see that here as well, that women tend to be more concerned about climate change and more keen to have ambitious climate policies, for example. We see that higher educated people also are more supportive of ambitious climate policies. But interestingly, perhaps we can also see differences between where people work. We see that people who work in sectors that are affected more strongly by the green transition policies, they tend to be a bit more skeptical. If we compare them directly, they're a bit more skeptical about green transition and the impacts of the green transition than people who work in industries, branches, jobs that are less directly affected by the green transition. So here's also some component, and perhaps that's also linked to the rural-urban divide.
Yeah, okay. How interesting. I know also that in this, in the report, you asked the question whether people think that climate policies are fair and affect everyone equally. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, that was one of the questions we were perhaps a bit puzzled, or we thought it was very interesting because we asked the question, do you think everyone in your country is equally affected by climate policies, no matter where you live? What we wanted to get at with this question is to see if people do think that they personally, perhaps in their areas, bear more of a burden of the green transition than others. And we thought that probably people in rural areas might be more likely to say climate policies are unfair because they affect us more. But in reality, we see the opposite. We saw that people in cities are more likely to say that climate policies have an unequal effect. And people who live in rural areas, they're more likely to agree like that, yes, climate policies affect everyone equally. So it's a bit opposite to what we would have expected, and I have no good answer to why this is the case. It's perhaps something to dig deeper into and also to compare if this comes up in other surveys.
Hopefully like somebody would actually look into that. I was also wondering if there's any questions from the chat at all. And I think I saw some that came up.
Yes. Maybe I take I'll improvise a little here and take my computer to the screen, and we can maybe try to take also some question later. But one question that I see here from Lil Rastad Bjørst, I probably mispronounced that, sorry. Anything specific about Greenland is the question here. And yes, we can say we also did, of course, interviews in Greenland. And the one thing that puzzled us in Greenland is that people tended to perhaps be a bit less worried about the green transition than in other countries. And we were really puzzled by this because we thought in Greenland, people probably have a much or experience the climate change a lot more closely. So we thought maybe they have stronger attitudes and also might be more worried about climate change. But we saw that the opposite was happening. People who responded, at least, were a bit less concerned about climate change than people in other countries. And we asked colleagues who work a lot in Greenland and have done many projects on climate issues in Greenland. And we asked them, how can we interpret this finding? And they told us, well, in their interpretation, people in Greenland are so used to the forces of nature and to work with nature or in nature that perhaps this is more they have more experience in dealing, also perhaps sometimes the unexpected events that happens, which are sort of helping them in that situation. So this could perhaps be one way to explain the answers. Then, of course, we have answers for Greenland for all the different questions we asked. So if you would like to know about anything in more detail, have a look at our report or write an email to me. We can discuss this much more in depth.
Any other questions here? I see there's one about the timeline here. Yeah, like were they spread out over the year? It seems. That's been a question.
What time period in 2022 and 2023 were the question asked spread out over the whole year? Yeah, okay. A question about the timing. This was a one-off survey that we did. We conducted all the interviews in October and November last year. There was perhaps sometimes a slight difference in timing when the interviews were done in specific countries or specific region, but it was all done in October, November last year. So it was not sort of a running survey, but a one-off survey in a particular period in time. Then of course it could be interesting to repeat the survey, do it again now in a year or two to see how attitudes may have changed perhaps, but that would be for another project. That cannot be done in the NJust project at the moment, unfortunately. But we would of course be very keen to see a follow-up.
Perfect, thank you. I see there are also more questions, but perhaps you can take some time to answer.
I'll try to bring some of your questions into the discussion later. Thank you already.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. And now we have one of our external speakers joining us, Kajsa-Stina, and she will share with us some insights from a project that is based on 7 focus groups from rural communities across Sweden and how they make sense of the justices and injustices of societal transformation that follows the green transition. So please, Kajsa-Stina.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I think it's a great webinar to be part of. I'm going to start by sharing my presentation, and hopefully you'll be able to see it very soon in presenter mode. Let's see. There we go.
Yes, perfect.
So the title of the project is Inclusive Climate Transformations, Living Sustainably Beyond the Cityscape. It's a project funded by Formas, which is Swedish Research Council for Sustainable Development. And apart from me, there's also a researcher called Therese Asplund involved in the project. One thing about being part of this webinar is that it's so great that I don't have to present my points of departure, because they're very much the same that the policy recommendations depart from. But I thought I would show just a little map of where these focus groups that Marie mentioned were carried out. So they're spread across Sweden, and they all took part in what is classified as rural municipalities, but they differ with respect to proximity to cities, infrastructure available, provision of services, natural resources, and level of tourism. But we wanted to sort of maximize the variety in perspectives and how people make sense of low carbon transformations. We paired with an organization called Hela Sverige ska leva, which is like all of Sweden should be viable, and also the Worker Study Association to actually sort of get some ties into all of these local communities. And the idea of this project is that we wish to present sort of more deeper or richer nuances of justice dimensions to avoid these pitfalls of stereotyping, but also to pinpoint areas of conflict or ways forward. Because if we move into some sort of tentative results, we do see that people experience distributive injustice, procedural injustice, recognitional injustice, spatial and cosmopolitan injustice. But we also see that there are a great many ways of making sense of these injustices. And just to give you some sort of examples, so yes, we do, for example, see that the people experience distributive injustice in relation to, for example, green energy projects, but we also see that there are sometimes very conflicting views, even within the same villages. And that leads me to the spatial justice dimension, because we found that people felt injustices both due to physical distance, for example, the distance to essential services, but also psychological distances. And that could be to the municipal centers, to like national decision-making bodies, but also to like the village centers. So there is a more nuanced dimension to find to spatial injustice than just along an urban-rural divide. Also, of course, now I've brought up examples of injustices, but there is also very much examples of ongoing local projects, or the idea that the transformation or the green transition does not really concern us. We are doing just fine, we collaborate, we find our energy solutions and so on. And of course, I can't go into detail into all of these results, even though I would like to, but in some, we find many ways of making sense of what makes low carbon transformations just or unjust. So what to do with this? And first, we suggest that these many different ways of seeing low carbon transformations that, in a sense, come from the periphery is a source to be used when crafting transformative pathways. So it's not finding out how people make sense in rural communities of green transitions is not just a way of figuring out whom and how to compensate for unfair distribution, but it's also about finding low carbon practices and organizing principles and so on. And this is also in line with what Mackin calls ecological agonism, which means that you sort of foster democratic disagreement over environmental issues, because that is understood to be crucial in provoking the emergence of alternatives to disrupt unsustainable conventions and engage citizens in lively politics. But to do so, then we also need to know whom to engage and why. And that is where a nuanced or more fine-grained view on spatial justice can tell us whom to include in our dialogues, for example. And it's not enough with a rural representative at the decision-making table or even one village representative, because you have to make sure that you sort of represent the diversity. And to tie this also to the policy brief that was presented in the beginning by Hilma, I see that this is where these joint negotiation tables, this early engagement and the transparent communication comes in. But I think we are still sort of struggling a bit to find exactly how to do this, how to find these ecological agonism, if you will, these joint negotiation tables. But I do think it's a very valid point and one that is important to make in the policy recommendation, that this is something that could be a way forward. Furthermore, I added this point down to the right, about the unjust image in relation to other justice dimensions, because the telling finding of the study was that many participants found the image itself of rural communities to be unjust. And that is also why I find the last policy recommendation relevant, the community building via holistic concept of justice, and to not only focus too narrowly on one form of monetary compensation, but to include these in policy frameworks, all the dimensions that render low carbon transformations to be perceived as just or unjust, because they may very well not be directly linked to a specific wind park or energy project, but to sort of surrounding policies, or even that unjust image that makes people not very keen to be on board on the green transition train. And just my last comment is that I appreciate that agency of local communities was sort of pinpointed in the policy brief as well, because this is something that we have been keen to investigate as well, and will take on in the next part of the project, actually working with the local community to with transformative learning, so that they can sort of gain ownership of their own transformation story. And I included a little list of references that will go with the presentation when it's sent out. But thank you.
Thank you, Kaisa-Stina. That was super interesting, and I think we're also really excited, obviously, to follow this next phase of your project about the agency. And I think it was so interesting that you mentioned this, like the unjust image of rural areas as well, like rural areas being seen as something that is a bit passive, perhaps, and whatever. And do you think that this kind of also, or this image, is forming the policies that the national governments are also, imposing somehow?
Yes, I definitely think that is informing those. But I will also say that sort of one of the starting points of this project was that, yes, Sweden has this goal of that will probably be revised, but of becoming the first fossil-free welfare state. And that should be inclusive, and we should take into consideration the different needs of rural communities, but they do not specify what those specific needs would be. But I do think that just sort of pointing out that, it will be troublesome for these because they have no other means of transportation, so that makes it hard. Whereas that image itself might not be something that everyone ascribes to, and definitely not that being, being the ones that are lagging behind, or the ones sort of in need of handouts, because that's definitely not how all these local communities view themselves.
No, exactly. Thank you so much, Kaisa-Stina, and we will hear more from you, obviously, in the panel discussion later on. So Stina is now next in line, and she will speak about the clashes between their local communities' efforts towards a more sustainable lifestyle versus the establishment of a large-scale industrial energy park. And we're super excited to hear about your direct experiences with this, Stina, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I was very inspired by the two previous presentations, and there was a lot of thinking going on, and I was writing a lot of stuff down whilst listening, because I think that one of the central aspects for me is the fact that we tend to always treat green transition as an exercise of central planning. And then it has to go center to periphery, like you make national planning, you make regional planning, and then you have to sort of find out how to make this viable in the local communities, and that's also how I met your research earlier on this autumn, talking about how to integrate citizens in green transition. And I think I made a comment at that time saying it's not a matter of integrating citizens in the transition of their own local area. It's a matter of citizens actually being able to transform their local area themselves, and supporting citizen initiative. In Denmark, we have the situation that big tends to always be regarded as most beautiful by the government. They want to make the largest energy islands, the largest energy parks, the highest windmills, the largest solar farms, etc., etc. And living in a local community, we tend to get the feeling, the impression that this is also about the interests of corporate business, because of course big is more beautiful when it comes to investors and highly efficient technologies. So I would like to just address the fact that most citizens I find in Denmark are concerned about climate change, very concerned. And most of them are actually very frustrated that they don't know how to make a difference. We want to act, but we don't know how to act. And for me to see the rollout of renewables might actually offer an opportunity for action, for enabling of the citizens. And if you look at it in that way, instead of this central planning aspect, then you have to also be concerned about much more than economical and job aspects, like regarding to the first presentation we had. You have to also look at social, cultural, life quality gains. What are the gains regarding a more integrated community, the gains regarding more values in everyday life that actually might make economical factors less important. Of course, you can only say that if you're not living on the verge of poverty, but most people in Denmark are not. So it is my experience from the local communities that I deal with, that many other factors are important for people, and that if you keep talking about economic factors and jobs, etc., you actually divert the focus of the people from life quality aspects. So that's something that I would like to address. I totally recognize the aspect of justice. That's both a global, a national, and a local issue when we're talking about climate change. But we also have to turn it around and have a look at the injustice, the massive injustice of climate change, and say that we need to be able to have a dialogue between legislators, administrators, business, and people about the fact that climate change is even more unjust than what we're talking about, the green transition. So we have to promote another view of on green transition. It's actually a matter of survival. It's not a business opportunity, and politicians have to start treating it as such. And that will also affect citizen attitude and the feeling of justice. And if I need to touch just on my completely local experience on this, I live in a community where people are actually living because they choose to live there. A lot of people are moving to our village, so we are one of the few villages in Denmark that is actually growing and expanding. And a lot of the people that choose to go and live here are motivated by being close to nature, by regenerational attitudes, growing organic greens, having a slower life, working long distance via the internet, using the internet to have a slower work life pace, and so on. And then what happens is the Danish government chooses to pinpoint our exact area as a space for the largest energy park to be rolled out in Denmark, and it's supposed to be like a sort of actually surrounding our village on 3 sides, meaning that we will not be able to look out of our windows without seeing these solar panels everywhere. It's like 750 hectares, which is quite a lot of solar panels around a village of 300 people. So what happens is you get all these people who are actually motivated by green attitude and wanting to do something for sustainability and so on, suddenly opposing this plan massively. And it's actually a war being fought right now. And my point would be that had the government not been so enthralled by this big business rollout of the largest energy parks, but instead asked local communities, how can you contribute? Would you like to be parts of this green transition? Do you have resources to take part in this? And then sort of building it up from the grassroots level. I think a lot of people also in my village would actually have been very resourceful and would have been able to make a difference. What happens now is they feel run over by large industry trains, and they start talking about compensation, finances, etc., which is that they also sort of degrade to primary needs instead of being actually the resourceful people that they are. So my point is, it's a matter of communication, but it's also a matter of the whole process from the beginning, accepting that people can be resources and not just something that has to be dealt with later on in the process. So that's my point. Yeah.
Thank you so much. There's so many interesting points here, especially this, going beyond the GDP part of this, or like the regional gross product as well. I was particularly interested in what you were saying about, how the central planning aspect just kind of, rolled out and you weren't really consulted. But what were the opportunity spaces here for you to engage? Were there any at all?
Not really, until we read in the newspaper that now the government had actually presented its plan for energy parks in Denmark, and there was a map. And we saw on this map that our village was surrounded by this, which was the largest energy park to be made. It was 750 hectares, and everybody started screaming. And then after that, local municipality, they reach out, they say, we want to have some meetings with the citizens and blah, blah, blah. But the damage had already been done. So right now we're in the middle of this, everybody being totally against and just fighting against it, and not being able to be sort of positive and constructive in the process, because it has been run completely wrong right from the outset. And that is my point. And then we start talking economy instead of actually being progressives and talking about how can we do our share. Because, I mean, had you asked us 3 months ago, we would have said we are ready to do our share of, or take our share of responsibility for the green transition. But now we're fighting for our life quality, which is much more important than money.
Well, absolutely. And I think what you said as well about, degrading people to, this kind of primary needs of money is a really interesting point here. And it seems to everything, that everything that we've been discussing today has got to do with agency, and like actually placing agency in the hands of the people who, are engaged in this or are, somehow being engaged in this. So thank you so much, Stine. And we'll also hear from you in the panel discussions. And we're going towards that now. Super interesting. I love a good panel discussion. This is my favorite part. This is where we get the juicy details and whatnot. So the purpose of our panel discussion today is to hear both then from academia again, as well as the practitioners together, and try to also engage you guys from the audience. And I'd love to hear more questions from you guys. So please use this chat function again. So yeah, do you want to come join me, Hilma?
Yes.
Perfect. So just to start off, so how do we make sure that nobody's left behind? This is like, I know this is a huge question, but in your opinion, what can we do?
Yeah, I think this is kind of like the key question, and I think a lot of things. Maybe one of the main problems is that we kind of take some things for granted. For example, we take for granted that the green transition will happen when we have this technology and we don't need social sciences for that. Or we take for granted that it will be just if we just put this central plan into action, and then it's a good idea or a good plan. So it will also be just because we made this something like a review of impacts, because we went through this procedure or something like that. But then, it doesn't just happen like that. So there should be this, this moment where we consider that the rural regions, for example, are very nuanced. For example, a municipality, at least in Finland, the municipalities can be pretty huge geographically. So they have a lot of very different areas within a municipality. So they have different needs. They have different cultural landscapes, different recreational lifestyles, like a different version of what is well-being, what is like the central aspects of what they expect from their local communities. So just kind of take this moment to kind of take a step back and see that we need to give the voice to the local communities. I guess that would be a start, at least.
Exactly, then have a bit more of a differentiated approach somehow, I suppose. Kajsa, Stina, what did you learn from your engagement with these rural communities?
Just to pick up on that, leaving no one behind, because I've been thinking quite a lot about that just recently and what that actually means. It means sort of that we see that some people are lagging behind or walking more slowly. And that in itself, I think, can be quite problematic. Just from the get-go, labeling some people, meaning sort of the big cities where the big projects take part, as the ones driving transformation or green transition, when that is not necessarily perhaps the case. So I think that is sort of one thing that is like crucial to do, actually, to sort of, I don't know, make an inventory of the sort of projects that are ongoing, of all the initiatives, and actually asking the question of what type of lives people want to live and why. Yeah, which is not a simple, policy answer or something like that. But I do think it is something that we must start looking at.
Absolutely, and I think this leaving no one behind, as you were saying, I think this is a really interesting like concept to delve into further as well. Like, what does that actually mean? Are we talking then, as Stina was saying, about the monetary part of it, or are we talking about actually leaving people behind in like development? Stina, would you like to elaborate on that at all?
Yeah, can you just sort of elaborate on the question and?
No, just like your thoughts about, being left behind. I mean, in this, we were discussing a bit about, the communications aspect in your case here. But do you think that your community would be able to keep up with the green transition if it isn't for the fact that they're trying to also invest in the area around your local community?
Okay, I understand your question now. Yes, I think we would. And I think central planners and researchers, no offense, tend to regard people as less empowered than they actually are, and thereby disempowering them. I think that the fact is that once people really grasp that this is serious business and we have to do something about it, and they are able to sort of distinguish or identify what tools they have to act, I think a lot of people are going to be able to keep up pace. But the fact right now is that most of us are in a state of, how do you say it in English? We know there's a big problem, but we don't know what to do. And then we tend to lean back and say someone else has to do something about it. And I'm just being a victim of change, and I'm being sort of run over, etc., etc. So I think the big thing is actually identifying the little things that people can sort of reach out for and use the tools for action. And tools for action are not identified once the big plan has already been drafted in the central offices or businesses. Tools for action have to be identified before that. So you have to integrate people in the actual formulation of the idea, instead of involving them as reactive respondents once you have formulated the idea. So that is actually my I mean, people do not get run over by development if they are driving the development themselves.
Exactly. And the question is just like, how do we do that? And how do we do that without the central planning objective as well? Like, I mean, there needs to be something driving the policies forward, but like, how do we, make sure that we include everybody? Yes, Tina.
Yeah, but what I see in Denmark is our government has totally failed to make this a wide, popular discussion. I mean, how do we have a national discussion on climate change? It's all been about bullshitting, greenwashing political initiative and greenwashing commercial or company initiative, and making plans for things that we, after 3 months, they throw out large plans, and then after 3 months, we're told by media it's not going to work anyway, it's going to be delayed, it's not efficient enough, etc., etc. So the whole discourse, national discourse, is making people disappointed and feeling unable. instead of creating a yes we can discourse, which will make people be creative and responding and taking charge. And I think it's a matter of being like, as a population, sort of parked on a sideway whilst someone else is making all the plans, and we can just watch and say it's not going to work. So actually, I'm trying to. I know it's a bit abstract, but it's a matter of how you start or how you run the discussions, the national discourses on green transition, and we're not going to solve that by more citizen hearings or more. We're going to solve that by changing language and by changing approach from the central governments and local governments.
Yeah, super interesting. Thank you for your perspective. And I'd also like to hear, is this something that you've seen in your policy research at all, in your research for this report?
Yeah, I think it is something that came up, that people really they're very sensitive to noticing if they feel like they are just like, I don't know, like a road post on the way, that now we're making this impact assessment and now there has to be a public hearing. But you kind of do notice if it is that the plan has already been made. But then, I think the idea is that there should be like a kind of a different mindset to the whole thing. And I'm not sure. It's very difficult to say then how it should be. Maybe there is kind of like that the strong Nordic tradition of regulation is sometimes even working against itself, because then is very good at some parts or some aspects of the justice, kind of like the legislation will be dealt as it should be dealt, and the process is going like this. But then it's very difficult then to kind of see that this is actually maybe working against its purpose in some instances. Yeah.
And I mean, considering how much power the municipalities have in the Nordic region, this, like the approach and changing the approach should really be possible, actually. I suppose if it's dealing on the ground level as well with these kind of transitions in a more local sense. Yes, Kaisa-Stina.
Yes, I thought it was interesting that Hilma said that we have this sort of strong, regulatory tradition in Nordic countries, but we also have a rich history of social movements in sort of bringing about social change, which I think is something that we might need to find, ways, because it's in a way, it's harder to connect to a societal project of green transition than sort of daycare or, an extra week of vacation, because that's so close to home. But if we do find these sort of spaces to create values, if you have it, or just like sort of figuring out what we can do and what our sort of capacity as agents is, and how we can sort of be involved in shaping society. I think we have to find sort of a way to tap into those social movements qualities.
And I think that's really interesting what you're saying about the social movement part here, and like we need to find our fight in this, I suppose, as individuals somehow, and that's obviously about engaging the citizen again, which is Stina's point. Yes, Stina, you also have your hand up.
Yeah, I was very happy about what you just said, Kaisa-Stina, because I totally agree with you. And actually, I've been sort of traveling the country with the message that we have to talk about what kind of society, what kind of world we want to live in, and not just deal with the green transition as a technological and financial thing. I mean, because it is not. It's also a matter of changing consumption habits, of changing living habits, of and so on. And politicians are not talking about this because they don't want to scare the people, because they believe that people are just economical creatures, thinking about not wanting to let go of their traveling, their meat, their clothes consumption, etc., etc. But actually, if you start talking to people about how life could become different and in a better way, life quality. You have this green field of sheep behind you. I mean, that's life quality to me. So, and then to many people once they experience it. So once you start talking about what is to gain from the transition, instead of just the losses that we might face. And the other research project was focusing very much on the losses, the financial implications, and so on green transition. Once we start focusing on the gains, I think it would be possible to engage people much more proactively. And to Evans, who just asked in the chat, I think that is also my opinion of the preparedness of rural communities. Is if you start talking to people in rural communities of what kind of life and community would they like to sort of transform or to sort of live in the future, then you get a lot more interesting discussion that can also lead to green transition initiative, but not to 750 hectares of solar panels around the village. So you have to leave out some other actors if you want to really succeed with this. It's the same thing as what's happening in Dubai right now. If you keep the Saudi Arabians at the table all the time, then you won't be able to get anywhere with the transition. It's the same thing locally. We cannot discuss this with the big financial institutions included around the table because it corrupts us.
I see, Hilma, you have a question or a comment as well, but just so you know, we have seen that you have a lot of questions in the chat, and we'll come to them very soon. But I'd like you to
just that I could also say a practical example that someone told me from Åland, and I think it was about this small hydropower in a small community there, and they said that there it had really like come this place that people kind of like to. I guess it's kind of like an area where people like to go for walks and for like recreation, and it kind of like looks nice, and they really feel kind of like attached to this project. And I think it is because it's small scale enough, and it doesn't feel like, I don't know, like you only lose something, like you lose your landscape or you lose the quiet of the nature, but you also kind of like can create something like a new type of maybe you can, if you change something, maybe it's also an opportunity to create a new type of a green space around it or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'd like to have a little look at all the questions in the chat as well. So Nora, would you like to come up and join us? We're nice and cozy around this little table here. What have people been asking?
Yes, exactly. So thanks, first of all, for everyone who already posted questions in the chat, and please keep doing that. We can try to put in a few more. Evan's question that came here last was already picked up now. I want to focus on two other ones. We have one question here about local ownership. What is the role of local ownership in this whole discussion? Could that be a solution to come up with new ideas to also avoid these big, large-scale projects, perhaps that just get placed on your feet, etc. So local ownership is the other thing. Another question comes from Thomas Norby, and that was, I think, more directed to me and the survey results we had. But I can't answer the question from my survey, so I thought I'll bring it into the group. So the question is that, from the survey, it seems that people in cities may be not very aware of what coming changes may mean to families and their family economies in rural areas. And that, I think, was an interesting thought, sort of in terms of perceptions. People in rural areas, of course, they have a completely different experience in life and how different changes and projects and initiatives affect them than people in cities. So do we need to talk more to each other to sort of exchange our experiences? How is it actually climate change impacts, but also all of these climate change initiatives, how they actually impact us and what they do? Because on paper, maybe it looks really good to have these large solar parks. Stina, perhaps this sounds like a good idea to a person who plans this in a city, but of course, then once you're there, you see what the reality actually is and how it impacts people. So do we need to talk somehow more to each other? Is there some communication problem here, maybe in our sort of lived realities? Perhaps something to comment on.
Yeah, Kajsa, Stina, do you have any thoughts on this communication between the urban and the rural? Yes, Stina.
I think you're right in some aspects that, of course, people in the urban cities, it's easy. I mean, I used to live in a city until 1 year ago, and it was more easy for me to say, okay, let's just roll out this these parks all over the country, so to get it done with. But even there doesn't have to be a division, because the fact could be, I mean, if you're ready to not talk about large areas in one part of the country, talk about several smaller areas, talk about building energy parks along the highways where nobody wants to live anyway, talk about using rooftops also in the city, etc., etc. You have to sort of not just talk about either we fill the whole countryside with energy parks, or we lose the race for green transition. And in that communication, you can engage both citizens from the cities and citizens from the countryside. So you have to move out of these bipolar sort of ways of looking at things. And I think also the discussion about the effects of climate change is very important. I mean, people in the countryside see it first. We saw it last summer with the droughts, and after that the floodings and the droughts and the floodings. And so you have to also work on the emotions of people, and not just on looking at either are you against it or are you for it, but have a more nuanced dialogue. And there you don't have to look at people as city people or countryside people. We all have a common goal, which is getting sort of this job done.
And I suppose we all tend to have some sort of connection to either the rural or the urban. You know, we always know somebody.
I mean, in Copenhagen, everybody comes from the countryside. You know, so I mean, and for most of them, their parents live out there. I mean, it's not like two different races of Danes.
No, exactly. And I mean, in your map, Kajsa-Stina, over where like the focus groups were, obviously there was, you know, some in the north and some in the south, and obviously the south is more populated as well and closer to bigger urban centers. Like, could you see any differences in the answers that you got in this at all on this topic?
I'm a bit weary of, you know, drawing conclusions about specifically the since I haven't done it. It's not a representative sample, you know. What I can say is that, I mean, there are differences, like physical differences between these places, but at the same time you can find many similarities, I think, and that I wouldn't necessarily say that the sort of differences that we see follow the geographical or municipal location, but rather other things like interests and core values and things like that, rather than sort of the specific location, which is interesting in itself, I think.
I mean, absolutely. Stina, you seem to want to say something on this.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, in cities, you find more academics, more people who are sort of also globally involved and politically aware and so on. And it also, just to build on what you're saying, is my experience that these people tend to have a different approach to the whole issue of climate change. So there are also social factors that define the attitude. So I totally agree.
Absolutely. Do you have any thoughts on this at all?
Well, this is just kind of guesswork, but I was also wondering that maybe in our areas also the demographics are a little bit different, perhaps, since there is this certain age group that is kind of like moving from rural areas to the cities. So then, yeah, I think if we would really want to go deeper into this, I think we would have to know a lot of the background factors that might affect how people see, for example, what is their time span when they think about the impacts. Maybe some people think 5 years and some people think 40 years, and then they might emphasize different things.
Absolutely. Yes, I was actually wondering if we have any more questions from the chat at all.
Yes.
There was the one about local ownership that I think we didn't really address.
Yeah, we can do that after, but we've...
I can maybe mention one more question together with the one on local ownership. The question was about the relative role about distributional policies versus communicating and educating people. So I guess the answer will be it's going to be a bit of both, or both is needed. But do you have any thoughts on this? So the question was, will distribution politics become increasingly important, even in the northern countries, due to the green transition? Or is it more this communication and education aspect involving people? Do you have any thoughts on this, perhaps?
Tricky one.
Yeah, it's a bit tricky without really knowing what we would mean by distribution politics. I guess it could take a lot of different shapes, but yeah, I'm not sure if the role of communication and education is so important as kind of like giving people an opportunity to kind of like affect this discussion and kind of like telling how we would look for them.
Stina?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think this, like, enabling people to be proactive when it regards to their own life and life expectancy also is the most important thing. And Reinhard also asks in the chat, I can see, could the solution not at least partly be local ownership and local economic benefits to counterbalance the environmental costs? And I think that is, for me to see, a fake, how you say it, it's a fake balancing, because it's not either I have money and to consume, or I have nature and life quality. I mean, putting it like that actually creates a fake discussion, which is not what it's all about. I mean, the thing is, what is life quality, and what kind of life do I want to live? And how can I be proactive in creating that? And that is more important than educating people from the central and to the periphery, which is a very sort of manuductive or patriarchal way of looking at things, in my point of view.
Absolutely. And I'm just wondering, because this is a really interesting discussion as well, this thing about, fake balance, or if it is an artificial balance, at least, like, that we have created this idea that justice comes from this kind of, idea of monetary, like having money, essentially, to be able to spend whatever. And I think that's a really interesting thing to delve even further into, at some point. Yes, Sima.
Yeah, I think also the local or regional ownership discussion is kind of interesting, because in my interviews, a lot of people said that if, for example, the energy company is not this, for example, a big German one, but it's a regional one, or at least a domestic one, then people feel a bit more connectedness to the project. And especially, I think now that we had the energy crisis, a lot of people felt that it's important to have like some self-sufficiency in energy. But then I got a sense that it was maybe something that people felt that maybe it's kind of all right, but then I'm not sure if it is a type of justice that then is like long lasting, or whether it's something that they think that maybe it's important, but then will it really kind of like create this actual value in the community?
Exactly. And Kaisa, Stina, you had your hand up as well.
Yes, I was thinking back to the distributive, and I mean, it also depends on what we distribute, right? So if we, for example, toy with one of these ideas of sufficiency, where you sort of look at like, what do you need to have a good quality of life, then you should, of course, see to distribute those qualities among people. But it might not be, money reimbursement for a natural resource if we wish to move away from sort of these extractive practices that sort of take something and you accumulate that and you distribute the wealth. So I mean, distribution is always going to be an issue if we want to create a just society.
Yeah, Stina.
Yeah, but Thomas also has a comment in the chat saying the rush for green transition tends to override the need for degrowth. And I totally agree, because we are so trained, and this is not because I'm an extremist leftist or anything. I'm actually a liberal, but we modern people are so trained to be consumers first, and then persons, humans. And if we're going to like save humanity from the climate breakdown, then we're going to have to invert this. We're going to have to talk about being humans in the world together and not making everything up in money. And that is a point that I think even middle-oriented liberal people, social liberal people like me, should try to work with, also in the way we discuss this both locally, nationally, and globally. Because if we make it up into only money, then we're dealing with an aspect that is going to be worthless in 50 years, because we're not going to make it. But if we start talking about being humans on the planet, then we could actually also engage people in transforming their local community actively into something that's benefiting the future. And I think it's very important, this, and that's why some people say we have to wait for the revolution. I say we don't have time to do that, so we have to start communicating differently and hoping for it to transform the attitudes. We cannot wait for a total revolution of the economical system. Yeah.
I think that's super interesting. And this kind of connects to one question we had about, the economy and the opportunity for green jobs following the green transition and everything. And considering that this panel is all female, I think that's also quite interesting, because it seems that, at least in Nora's survey, that females are more positive about the green transition in general than men are, or at least more worried and want more ambitious climate policies. But women are not the ones with the jobs that are in need of changing, and being part of the green transition. So I was just wondering, do you think that there is a positive way of kind of maybe challenging then the patriarchy a bit, as we were talking about earlier, about the green transition being part of this kind of idea of growth rather than degrowth? Do you have any thoughts on that at all? Is this an opportunity to have some sort of, revolution from within in that sense, women taking the lead?
I can comment. I think maybe one of the reasons is that women tend to work more in the public sector, where the paycheck is not as great as in the industry. And I think maybe then you see that maybe the green transition is kind of given to the public sector, that it's still kind of siloed, that, all right, you can talk about it here, and then here we try to keep it as business as usual. So yeah, there should be kind of a mindset change where it is kind of embedded, baked into other types of industries as well.
Exactly. Do we have any more questions?
Yes, we do. Yes, I can bring in maybe two more questions here, and one is directed to me regarding the survey. So maybe I'll start with this one, but then I also have one for Kajsa Stina. So the question to me was from Evans, and he asked to what extent the results from the survey could be influenced by media narratives around the green transition, and if so, how individual agency and capabilities can shape this. And of course, we don't know from the survey to what extent people were influenced in their answers by media narratives. So this is not a question we explicitly asked for. So we don't know to what extent people answered in the survey because of what they read in the media. But perhaps an interesting side note is that we saw in the survey results that people from Finland were a bit more skeptical about the green transition and a bit less worried about climate change than people in other Nordic countries. And we thought that was very interesting. So we asked Finnish partners in the study about this. And they, of course, didn't know the answer for sure either, but they thought that in the context of the last election, green transition had been a big topic, and it had often been portrayed rather as something challenging, something that takes from us, something that makes us having to give up our routines and the way we live. And of course, perhaps that could also explain why in Finland people answered slightly differently than in the other Nordic countries. But again, this is nothing we can see from the survey. This is just a speculation that our Finnish partners had when they saw the results. But so I think you're on the right path there. I think, of course, how we discuss, and it also came up already in the discussion here, how we discuss the green transition, if we focus on the things we have to do differently, or if we can focus more on the benefits, that will also, of course, impact very much how people then think and act and see this whole process. And I think in this context, also what we talked about here, this kind of local action really matters, because I think if you are in a local community where change happens, where you feel like you're part of and you're active, that of course has a strong influence on how you feel about the green transition in spite of everything you read in the media. So there's some sort of, I think, added value here on these local initiatives and on becoming active at this level. But then a question for Kajsa-Stina, and perhaps, of course, you might also want to comment on this particular comment. But for Kajsa-Stina, there was a question just a bit more in detail on your study. How far north did you go in Sweden in your map? So how much of the northern parts of Sweden were you actually able to cover? Perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more on this. This was a question in the chat.
Yes, so for those of you who know Swedish geography, the northernmost focus group took place in Västerbotten. So as far north as you can come close to the Baltic Sea, so where, you know, it splits into Finland and Sweden. We had sort of actually 3 focus groups planned in Lapland, so even further north, but those were very hard to recruit participants for, so we actually didn't carry them out. So there is sort of a blank space, the northernmost sort of western part of Sweden, I'd say.
Thank you. And I think I did see that there was one more question in the chat as well, and I think that's a nice nice thing to end on here. And that is actually, if you have any good examples, good case studies and whatnot, that actually shows you know, how local communities have avoided triggering this kind of, or like their inclusion have avoided triggering these kind of resistance feelings in people. Do we know of any good examples that we can direct our listeners towards?
Well, I can mention, it's hard to say that there was no resistance, because you would have to make like very extensive interviews and really follow the process. But I think in Skive, with this Green Lab park, at least the municipality had the impression that there was more maybe kind of like skepticism, because the municipality really invested a lot of resource in it. So what if it doesn't work? But not so much of this direct resistance. And I think it's probably because there was so much engagement and so much discussion from the very start, when it was only kind of like as an idea, and they already had something like this open doors to an office where people can come. And then they have also worked a lot, for example, with farmers, with kind of like this circular economy, so using waste from farmers that they can then sell to the industrial park. So I think it seems that this is kind of very well within the community.
So learn from Skive. Nora wanted to say something.
Yeah, just to add to the discussion on my side, I don't have any good answers at the moment, but I wanted to point out that the project where we did the survey, the NJust project, we have a task there to develop a toolbox for the green transition for the Nordic countries. So to come up with concrete examples, best practices, recommendations from research, from actual work that's being done on how can we best do this, how can we make sure that this is a more just transition. And of course, one important part of the toolbox will focus on engagement. So while I don't have any good answers now, we actually aim to do just that, trying to find these good examples where it has worked. One thing I noticed is that sometimes it can help to be perhaps a little bit broader in your thinking and in your searching. We know, of course, that coal transition has been a major part in lots of countries in Europe. And my impression is that if you go there might be some examples of how they engaged the miners, the local communities when they closed down mines. And perhaps there's something to learn for other parts of the green transition as well. So sometimes perhaps it can be good to look a bit further left and right to see if there's anything from past history that we can learn from.
Exactly, creativity and inspiration in general. We are coming very close to the end of this webinar, and I just want to say it's been extremely interesting, very enlightening, and I really appreciate your participation here. This has been a very meaningful conversation, I think, in general, and I hope that everyone who's listening is also thinking, you know, interesting and that you want to take this further and engage in this conversation somewhere. And just to remind you again that the policy brief that Hilma is writing for this will be published back in January. And I would like to wish you all a really happy holiday as well. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah.